According to Statista.com, a great site for statistics, in 2011, the minimum salary for an NFL player was $375,000. In 2021, that minimum has increased to $660,000, and it is projected to increase to about $1 million by 2030. The point is, why would NFL players ever commit a crime that would land them in prison, since they can easily make a salary that could pave the way for the easy life for them and possibly even their grandchildren's grandchildren? It's a concept that is difficult to comprehend. But in this video, you're going to learn about some of the most famous NFL players who became infamous as they went to prison. Now is the time to hit that thumbs up and subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because the NFL prison bus is on the move. Sam Hurd, sentenced to 15 years. Sam Hurd signed a 3-year contract with the Chicago Bears worth $4.1 million. This contract included a $1.3 million signing bonus and an average salary of $1.3 million per year. So to say that the NFL wide receiver had plenty of promise during his early days in the NFL is an understatement. Some may remember him torching the New York Giants for an impressive touchdown during a nationally televised game while he was playing for the Dallas Cowboys. But that might be all you remember about him. What you don't know is that Sam Hurd was arrested on federal drug charges after attempting to procure 500 or more grams of cocaine from a North Texas supplier. And the info that will shock you is that Hurd was actually a high-level boss of a drug-dealing operation. His operation raked in about $2 million per month. With evidence against him, he decided to enter a guilty plea in his federal drug case. He was given a sentence of 15 years in prison. Art Schlichter, sentenced to 16 years, 10 years. Back in 1982, you would have thought you had a winning ticket if you placed a bet on Art Schlichter. He had the talent to be one of the best and youngest quarterbacks in all of the NFL. Unfortunately, betting on a man addicted to gambling would have caused you to lose your wallet, because this addiction landed Art in prison. Art ended up spending more time in prison than in any pro football league due to crimes he allegedly committed, all because of his gambling habits, and he earned a prison sentence of 16 years in 1997. Reports confirmed that prison wasn't any sort of rehabilitation for him, because while he was in prison, he was still gambling on the inside and outside. So when he was able to get out of prison, his game only intensified, and he was able to rob millions of dollars from unsuspecting sports lovers by promising them certain tickets to professional sports games, yet never delivering the said goods. So he went back to prison in 2012 and is expected to be released this year in September. Tommy Kane, sentenced to 18 years. Tommy Kane earned an opportunity to play wide receiver in the NFL when the Seattle Seahawks took a flyer on him in the 3rd round of the 1988 NFL Draft. Kane found the end zone 9 times between 1988 and 1992, but his career ultimately ended because of injury woes. Then in November of 2003, Kane's family suffered a tragedy. Kane, possessed by rage after Sheik, the mother of their 4 children, arrived at his mother's house with a counselor from his church with the objective of intervention, as Kane had been heavily involved in cocaine and alcohol. They attempted to convince him to go to a detox center, but that plan backfired, and Kane ended up stabbing his wife several times. He pled guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to 18 years in prison. 16 years later, he was back on the streets, and then in 2019 was returning to prison for breaking the conditions of his parole due to cocaine and alcohol consumption. Lawrence Phillips, sentenced to 31 years. The number 6 overall pick in the 1996 NFL Draft, Lawrence Phillips was undeniably a talented running back, but he caused more strife and stress than his contributing factors to his NFL team due to numerous allegations of physical violence. And due to these allegations, Phillips was never able to reach the superstar level that was surely in his potential. Years after his NFL disappointments, Phillips was sentenced to over 31 years in prison after he allegedly attacked his girlfriend. To make matters much worse, he had also reportedly drove a vehicle into 3 teenagers. Then, while in prison, he was accused of killing his cellmate. Finally, in 2016, at only 40 years old, he hung himself in prison. Ray Caruth, sentenced to 24 years. Ray Caruth was a formidable wide receiver for the Carolina Panthers and was talented enough to be their first-round draft pick, but his dreadful day occurred in 1999 when Cherika Adams, a woman he was dating, was shot to death. Jerica Adams was pregnant with Caruth's child at the time of the murder, and prosecutors argued Caruth had Adams murdered because she refused to have an abortion. In court, he was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, and it was discovered that although he didn't physically pull the trigger, he was the initiator of the plot. He was sentenced to roughly 24 years in prison. And even though Jerica Adams died, the child lived on with a handicap and was raised by his grandmother. He was in prison from 1999 to October of 2018, and it is reported that he now has a good relationship with his son. Daryl Henley, sentenced to 42 years. Written years ago, yet still a memorable report, ESPN's Shelley Smith wrote a fascinating and heartbreaking story about the rise and fall of Daryl Henley. In the report, readers learn how Henley found success playing football at UCLA, and he went on to become a defensive back for the Los Angeles Rams. Roughly 6 years after he entered pro football in the 1989 NFL Draft, Henley received a prison sentence of 20 years after he was convicted on drug charges. But that's not the end of the story. Henley was later found guilty of attempting to hire someone to assassinate the judge and a witness. This resulted in Henley being imprisoned until 2031, which will make him 65 years old when he's even eligible for parole. Robert Rozier, sentenced to 25 years to life. The story of Robert Rozier, aka Nira Israel, might be the most bizarre in this video. His conduct off the field greatly overshadows his talent on the field. He joined a black supremacist group called Yahweh's Brotherhood and confessed that between 1981 to 1986, he had killed 7 white men. Rozier admitted to killing the 7 individuals to please the black supremacist leader, and although he received a 25-year sentence, since he was cooperating with authorities by divulging all information, he was actually released 10 years later. But that freedom didn't last long. The cult killer was back in the hands of Johnny Law as he allegedly intentionally used checks that he knew would bounce. And it's true, such crimes don't hold so much weight in the entire scheme of things, but since he had already been involved in heinous crimes, 3 strikes got him out of civilized society and back into the penitentiary. Aaron Hernandez, sentenced to life without parole. Aaron Hernandez was one of the best tight ends in the NFL while starting for the New England Patriots during the 2012 season. He signed a $41 million contract, which was the second largest ever for a tight end. He donated $50,000 to a charity that touched the hearts of his fans and team owner. But nobody really knew that even in his college years, he was a murderer. And mutually, nobody could have guessed at the time that all would take place over the next 5 years. Hernandez was arrested and charged with murder among other crimes in the shooting death of Odin Lloyd in 2013. And he was eventually found guilty of killing a man once thought to be his friend. While serving a sentence of life in prison without parole, Hernandez faced murder charges regarding a double homicide that occurred in Boston back in the summer of 2012. While Hernandez was found not guilty of killing those 2 individuals, on April 2017, the 27-year-old still hung himself. Anthony Smith, 3 life sentences. Anthony Smith was a well-known defensive lineman in the 1990s. The number 11 pick of that draft class spent 6 total seasons with the Los Angeles Lakers and Oakland Raiders before he retired in 1997, which actually shocked many of his fans. 2 years later, brothers Ricky and Kevin Nettles were kidnapped and murdered. Then, in 2001, a man named Dennis Henderson was also kidnapped and stabbed to death. The culprit of these crimes went unpunished until 2015. The culprit, Smith, was finally convicted of those murders. Additionally, he was suspected of being responsible for a 4th homicide, even though a jury failed to convict him. Regardless of that final case, Smith received 3 life sentences without parole. Keith Wright, sentenced to over 230 years. Journeyman defensive lineman Keith Wright only played in the NFL for a few seasons, and even though you might be an NFL buff, you may not remember him because he saw little playing time over a 3-year period. In August of 2011, Wright was arrested regarding a trio of alleged robberies that occurred in a neighborhood of Sacramento, California. It was reported a handgun was used in each of those thefts. According to the Associated Press and CBS Sacramento Sports, Wright was actually convicted of a variety of crimes, which consisted of a total of 19 that authorities are aware of. These various crimes consisted of armed robbery, kidnapping, first-degree burglary, false imprisonment, and forcible oral copulation. Wright received 114 years to life, along with an additional 120 years and 8 months, meaning he theoretically would not be eligible for parole until over 2 centuries have passed. And since this is the longest sentence on this video, we will now conclude. Which of these NFL players shocked you the most? And were you ever a big fan of any of them? If so, how did you take the news of their evil deeds? Leave your comments down below, like, share, subscribe, and ring that notification bell.